Let's chop up some college football with the season just about 3 weeks away. We got Aaron Torres here from the Aaron Torres podcast. You can also catch him on Fox Sports Radio. He's right here on YouTube, cranking out some great content, college football, college basketball all year round. Aaron, it's been a while. What's going on?
It's been a while. You're busy. I like to think that I'm busy. And I will say from a distance, man, it's been awesome to watch your growth and to see the growth of your entire community. So congrats on all your success. People don't know this. You're one of my early YouTube mentors. I don't want to call you Mr. Miyagi because that makes you sound old, but you like I said, it's so awesome to see your growth, and you've taught me a lot about this business. So I appreciate you, and I'm really excited to be joining with you.
Well, we have been connected for a long time, and I'm certainly keeping tabs on your growth as well. And it's been mighty impressive on your end as well. So we appreciate you stopping by, Aaron. Let's talk college football. Let's talk the season. The teams are in camp right now, trying to get ready for everything that ensues starting week 0 with Florida State and Georgia Tech. While I brought up the Seminoles, let's stop right there. Sure. What was your take on the snub from the playoff, with the quarterback situation being what it was? Where did you stand on that decision?
Well, it's crazy actually, because I host on Fox Sports Radio, as you referenced, and I host the Saturday postgame show. And so we were on air probably the fourth quarter of that ACC championship game. And you could see by the end of the day that this was going to be a thing. And I'll be honest, I don't really think there was another argument. I think there were some people that felt like if Oregon had beaten Washington, would a one-loss Pac-12 team get left out? But it really felt like the whole time it was going to come down to Alabama versus Florida State. And I guess what I would say is, listen, I feel awful for Florida State fans. And what I would say is that defense last year was just so elite. And you saw that in the home stretch, shutting down Florida in the swamp, beating Louisville in the ACC championship game. But the committee, the number one task of that committee is to put the 4 best teams on the field in that previous expired, rest in peace 14 playoff. And I just thought it was really hard to make the argument for Florida State with the team that they had with Jordan Travis. I know a lot of people made the analogy at the time, but it was almost like that unfortunate year where Cincinnati basketball was the number one team in the country and Kenyon Martin gets hurt in the conference tournament and they got bumped down to a 2 seed. They ended up losing early in that tournament, but they weren't the same team without Kenyon Martin. So one thing I would say is you feel terrible for Florida State. They really, and the other thing that people forget, like they had 2 weeks to prove that Jordan Travis, the impact of that injury wasn't monumental, and they literally couldn't move the football without him. So I feel bad for him. Biasly, I was also at that Alabama-Michigan Rose Bowl. I live in Southern California, so I think it turned into a much better game, the one that I got to see, as opposed to what it would have been with Michigan versus Florida State. Good news was talking to a buddy of mine close to that program this week. And the good thing is they don't ever have to worry about it again. If they're the ACC champs, not only are they getting into that playoff, but, they'll probably, frankly, almost certainly get a first-round bye in the current format. So that's my long-winded answer. You feel bad for Florida State, but the job is to put the 4 best teams on the field. And I felt like coming off that ACC championship game in conjunction with the SEC championship game, Alabama was probably the more deserving team.
So if we stay right there in the ACC, Aaron, new 17-team league. A lot of people are talking about SMU possibly making some noise as a dark horse. But looking at the top, Miami seems to have the best roster that they've had in quite some time. The recruiting's been ridiculous. They pick up Cam Ward as the probable best quarterback in the conference. Florida State, the defending champions, lose a ton. But Mike Norvell seems to have brought this program to a place where they can sustain success. And then you got Clemson trying to bounce back from 3 subpar seasons. So how do you shake out the ACC?
How dare you leave out the new team with the helmet in the background from Mark Rogers, Stanford. I was looking at that before we went on air, and I was like, look at that ACC power, the Stanford Cardinal. But
if this was 2014 and not 2024, maybe I would have brought up the Cardinal.
No, I don't. I'm going to go out on a limb and say they won't be a factor in that ACC title race. So no, I'll say this is that I think what you said about Miami is where I'm at with this conference. Is best roster, in my opinion, top to bottom in this league. We know what they did in the portal all off season, and then they really amplified it even more in the spring, adding Damian Martinez and a couple other pieces on the defensive side of the ball. And so what you said is where I'm at. Is Cam Ward's the best quarterback, probably at least the most accomplished in this league. And I think you look at some of the other rosters, is I actually am not as down on Clemson as everybody else, but I got to see the Cade Klubnik thing work before I can get too excited. And with Florida State, listen, where I'm at is I what you said about Mike Norvell is where I'm at. He's an elite coach. Like I said, I was talking to somebody there this week, and they kind of made it a point to say he's great at kind of taking the pieces that he has, making it work. And I do think they'll probably get more back to like a heavy run-based offense. They led the ACC in rushing 2 years ago, and they were so dynamic in the pass game last year, they got away from it. But I hate to be a jerk, but I just think it to me, I've lived the DJU experience for 4 years now. Doesn't mean he's a bad kid. Doesn't mean he's a bad person. And, by sort of technicality, he won an ACC title a few years ago. But I look at that league and I just think with the losses everywhere else, I just don't know that I believe that DJU can elevate his game to the point that is needed for the Florida State Seminoles to go back-to-back in the ACC, like the roster outside of them. I know Norvell has said this is kind of the deepest roster he feels like he has in terms of playable players. But sometimes, the college game is a little bit like the pro game. You either got to do it at quarterback or you don't. I know Miami does. And until I'm proven otherwise, I just have too many questions about DJU.
Brent Pry made a comment at ACC Kickoff Media Days the other day that if they don't reach the ACC championship game, that he'll be disappointed. It will be a disappointment. They bring back some of the highest level of production in the country. Chiron Drones at quarterback. So Virginia Tech, NC State, what Dave Doran has done there, I don't think gets much recognition on the national level because the records look similar, but if you run the numbers, he was 21-35 in ACC play at one point, and he's 23-11 the last 3 seasons. So they're playing much better. Those two seem to be the ones that people are talking about on the fringe. Do you have any dark horses in the ACC?
No, I mean, Virginia Tech's the one that kind of comes to mind. I think the question for me with them, you have Miami early on the road, then you have a cross-country flight to play Stanford. I know we were joking, but, listen, I'm sure you've been talking about it all offseason, is I know we kind of just, in passing, just kind of make jokes about not just the ACC, but, the Big Ten. Again, I live in LA. Rutgers is going to be playing at USC on a Friday night. And I do wonder, just in the bigger picture, about the travel element for all of these teams. But again, you look at somebody like Virginia Tech, right? You come into the season with real expectations. First of all, you do play Rutgers out of conference. A lot of Rutgers hype right now. I think I saw Kirk Herbstreit say he thinks that they might be a fringe playoff contender in terms of, getting maybe a 4th seed out of the Big Ten or, 4th place finish, whatever. But so Virginia Tech has Rutgers. But then, like I said, you play Miami and it's on a Friday night. All of a sudden, say you lose that game. Now you got to fly across country. You're probably playing at a weird time on the, maybe a 10:30 Eastern time kickoff. So I just think the travel in general will be interesting to me. So I would say that Virginia Tech kind of does, in my opinion, kind of qualify for the team that I think is kind of intriguing. I would add too, I think week 0, it'll be interesting to watch Georgia Tech. I wasn't a Haynes King guy, and then maybe I realized that it was more Jimbo Fisher than it was Haynes King. But, they're coming off obviously a bowl eligibility season down there. And I think there's a lot of excitement in that with that team. And they're going to have a national stage early to show everybody how good they are. So I don't know that I feel great about any of those teams necessarily getting to Charlotte. But in terms of like dark horse teams that I think could surprise some people and maybe end up in Charlotte, those would be the ones for me.
You brought up Rutgers, Aaron, so I'm going to keep us right there because that's a bit fascinating. And I had noticed in the schedule months ago, because the larger the leagues get, the more the schedule plays into it because you're missing as many teams in a 17-team ACC. You play 8, well, you miss 8. So it's really key as to who you're playing. And for Rutgers, they could be missing the top 5 teams in the Big Ten. They don't play Ohio State, Michigan, Penn State, Iowa, or Oregon.
It's
So
crazy.
whether you go Iowa or USC as the 5th best team, basically the 5 best teams in the conference, they miss them. So this is their opportunity.
Well, and what you just said is, to me, just it's the biggest thing that I don't think the casual, it maybe I'm not being fair to college football fans, but it's the thing that I think in our space isn't being talked about enough. I've said for months now, you go to the NFL and every year, again, I host national radio. It's always a talking point this year. Okay, who's going to go in the NFL from worst to first? A Houston Texans like run last year. And I only bring it up because part of it is whenever you're picking those teams, there's always this guy drafted, this team drafted this guy's getting healthy, blah, 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 blah. But then there's also just, if you're by definition a last place team in the NFL, you are playing a last place schedule. And so in theory, you're going to have a lot of kind of, not very good teams on your schedule. And so I think with college football, that's just something that I don't think the average fan realizes just how big it's going to be in college football this year. I know we're not talking SEC. I know you just referenced Rutgers, but, look at Oklahoma's schedule versus Texas's schedule. Texas has 3 true road games this year. At Vanderbilt, at Arkansas, at A&M. Now, Arkansas could, in theory, be a tough place to play because obviously Texas lost there the last time they played there a few years ago. But, I mean, you're talking about 2 of the 3 teams picked to finish at the bottom of the league. Those are your road games. And then you avoid Alabama. This is Texas we're still talking about. You avoid Alabama. You avoid LSU. You avoid Ole Miss, a lot of these really good teams. And then counter that with Oklahoma that has to, host Alabama, go to Ole Miss, go to LSU, Texas on a neutral. You go on and on down the list. And it's like, I don't think there's as much gap in this conversation about Texas and Oklahoma in talent as people might think, but the gap in schedule is unbelievable. And so whether it's Rutgers, whether it's Iowa, who avoids Oregon and Michigan and Penn State. I mean, Iowa was actually the one that jumped out to me, Mark, even more than Rutgers, because, we're coming off this Big Ten East, Big Ten West era of, man, you're coming off the high of a great Michigan-Ohio State game. Then you got to go watch them play Iowa every year, and it's a snore fest. And I'm like, I'm not so sure that Iowa might not be in the Big Ten championship game again this year as well, because, again, no Oregon, no Penn State, no Michigan. So whether it's Rutgers, whether it's Texas, it doesn't really matter. What you said is so important, is there's just going to be imbalanced schedules. And there's just always going to be those teams that benefit from them. And conversely, teams like in Oklahoma that are really hurt by them as well.
We finished up last season with Michigan winning the national championship. Georgia slipped up once. There were still some folks like me that thought, I'm not going to take the trophy from Michigan. Of course, they've earned it, unless we want to go into some other issues with Michigan football, but we'll stick to the field. But would have loved to have seen Georgia and Michigan play. However, Georgia didn't get it done when it counts. But this is considered to be the best roster in the country. Maybe Ohio State, I believe, has more top-end talent. But if you go complete roster, it's Georgia, best program, best coach, the whole deal. This seems to be a Georgia championship to lose to a certain extent.
I mean, I agree. Now, what's interesting, 2 things can be true. One, Georgia is kind of a little bit of a victim of what we just talked about with the schedule. Is there is no Vandy this year. There is no South Carolina this year. Those would have been the 2 teams picked at the bottom of the SEC East that obviously no longer exists. Now you got to go to Ole Miss. Texas is obviously added. You got to go to Bama. And so I think it's a weird thing where we might look at the top of the SEC standings at the end of the regular season and Georgia's not atop of it. I think there's a scenario where they don't even make the SEC championship game, but I don't think they're going to lose enough to not make that 12-team college football playoff. And again, I think it's about readjusting our brains. Again, I don't mean to keep switching teams and switching topics, but I was just asked about Michigan this morning by somebody else. And I said, well, look, if this was a 14 playoff era, I don't think they're making the 14 playoff with road game at Ohio State, home game against Oregon, home game against Texas, etc. But it's a 12-team playoff. And it's the same with Georgia where, listen, Now you just got to get into the dance. And I'm with you, is that listen, I think there were numbers that came out from Vegas that Georgia would have been favored over every team in that playoff last year, even Alabama, who they lost to head to head in Atlanta last year. So I know I'm going in a lot of different directions, but that's another variable that I don't think enough people factor into this new playoff era. Is it's just about getting into that 12 team scenario. And then if you're Georgia, if you're on Ohio State, like, I think it just completely reconfigures what you deem to be a successful season or a failure of a season, right? Like, and I know I'm going long here, so forgive me, but let's take Ohio State. Let's say you finish 10-2 and you lose to Michigan again. You don't make the Big Ten championship game, but you're the 11 seed. As you said, Mark, you're good enough to beat anybody in the country. You go on to win the national championship. Now, all of a sudden, nobody cares about the Big Ten. Nobody cares about Michigan. So again, it's been a theme all offseason for guys like you and I that love this sport, but this sport is just going to be so different when everybody takes the field here in a few weeks.
Aaron, I love you jumping around. You've got the stage. You say whatever you want.
Okay.
You take it away. Just that's why we got you
I
here.
had too
But
much coffee this morning. My brain's going in all sorts of directions here. Forgive me.
Well, you said enough things there that my brain's going in about 5 directions too, because you said so many things that I'd like to hit on. The last being the Ohio State situation. So we saw a precursor of this in 2022. What happened? Ohio State got drummed by Michigan. They still make the playoff, a 14 playoff, and they come within a missed field goal of playing for the national championship. And everybody on planet Earth believes that they would have clubbed TCU with no issue. So that would have been a situation where, oh, you lost this all or nothing, what is paramount to Ohio State fans, beating Michigan. But no, you're the national champion. It doesn't matter. And now that opportunity's there every year. It's just as strange because this sport, ever since we've been watching it and way before us, Aaron, has obviously been about these massive rivalries and these all or nothing games in the regular season. And nothing depicts that more than Ohio State and Michigan. And it's almost like sacrilege to say, you know what? If you're Ohio State, you can, if you're Michigan, you can lose that game and still make the playoff and win the national championship. And who's going to then care about a loss in November to Michigan?
No, and it's interesting because I don't know where you have stood on the topic, but this was like, at a certain point, you just come to accept this is what it is, and there's no going back. But what I've said for 2, 3, 4 years now is it's interesting to me that really every sport in America outside of the NFL is trying to figure out ways to make their regular season more interesting. NBA has this in-season tournament that I don't really think anybody cared about, but whatever. MLB's changed all their rules to get people in and out of the park faster. College football had the most compelling regular season by a mile. By the way, you mentioned off the top, I love college basketball. I'm one of a handful of people that watch regular season college basketball, but I understand that nobody really watches the sport till March. So I just bring it up because it is what it is. There's no going back, but it is now a postseason sport, right? And listen, it's always about winning the championship, winning at the highest levels, but you talk about all the variables where that Michigan-Ohio State game doesn't quite mean as much. I'll take it a step further. Big Ten Media Days, all those coaches were asked about the idea of, like, if you're Ryan Day right now and you're 11-0 going into that Michigan game, and you've clinched a spot in the Big Ten championship game, and you've got 4 or 5 guys that are banged up, like, it might make sense to rest them because you're probably in the playoff no matter what, and you want to win that Big Ten championship game to get the first round bye. So imagine that. Imagine basically a load management scenario in a rivalry game or in a late season game that matters to your fans and matters to college football. So I don't like it. I don't know if we'll ever get there, by the way. I think it'd be a very unique scenario, but now we've, the postseason, there's more spots, those, and I will say, to the credit of college football, they have kept that conference championship very meaningful. But again, it does devalue the regular season. And again, this is why so many of us love this sport. And I will be curious because, the pro expansionist people are adamant that the regular season isn't going to mean less, and that, oh, by the way, it's actually going to mean more because there's more teams involved. I actually fundamentally disagree with that. I don't think we will care. Like, I don't think the conversation about Iowa versus Oklahoma at number 13 versus 12 is going to be nearly as interesting as Florida State, Alabama was last year. I don't think we've ever cared about Iowa on a national scale. No disrespect. I know you have a big following with that Hawkeye fan base, but like, we've never cared about Iowa. And I don't think college football fans are going to be glued to Iowa, Nebraska 6-3 in the fourth quarter because Iowa could get the 11 seed if they win that game. I just don't believe that's going to happen. So the postseason is going to be awesome, bigger than it's ever been. There's no doubt. But I just don't buy this thing of that it's going to have no net negative on the regular season. Could be wrong. We'll start to find out here in a few weeks.
I think there's a lot of pros and cons there. The only, I'll take the same concept, but apply it to SEC teams that might be a little sexier.
Sure.
7-2 Auburn, 7-2 LSU in the former model. Nice game. If you love college football, you're going to watch this game. Two good teams, but it has no effect on the college football playoff. They're both out of it. But suddenly, this game is monumental. It's huge.
Yeah. No,
So there will be those games.
No doubt. And I remember, and we don't have to go long on this, but I remember last year was, week 9, week 10. I think that exact scenario happened with Tennessee and Missouri. It was like week 10, both are 8-2. And it was kind of billed as, hey, in a year from now, this is going to be a de facto playoff elimination game. So we will get those. We'll see. If I just wonder, if Missouri is playing Tennessee on one channel and Ohio State's playing Penn State, I still think we're just going to watch Ohio State, Penn State, even if there's, maybe that's a bad example. Let's say, Ohio State versus somebody big, but Ohio State versus USC. I know they're not on the schedule this year, but Ohio State versus USC, USC's 7-4 and they're out of the playoff picture, but they're still two huge brands. I'm just curious. I'm curious if it changes our viewing habits in terms of tuning into those teams that maybe we would be less likely to. I'm not sold that we will, but again, I'm happy to be proven wrong as this thing goes on.
The Ohio State-Michigan dynamic could be used for Georgia, Alabama, and some others, but it's more Ohio State, Michigan, because that's always been the last game of the season. It's the biggest rivalry, et cetera, et cetera. What I think is going to play out here eventually is that the first time that they play in a Big Ten championship game after the regular season matchup is going to be epic. It's going to be, wow, they're playing again next week. That's going to be fun. And then it's unthinkable, but certainly possible. They play in the playoff. They play a third time for the season, much like an NFL matchup among two teams in the same division. I think the first time that happens, it's going to captivate people. I think if that happens 3 times in 7 or 8 years, it's going to start to turn people off. Like, this used to be special.
Mm-hmm. No doubt. No, there's no doubt. And that was, a lot of what was at stake last year. I mean, even last year, you go back, both, it's easy to forget now. Ohio State was 11-0 just as much as Michigan was 11-0 in that game. But you could also see the playoff scenario shaping up where it was hard to see the pathway for the loser of that game to then make a 4-team college football playoff. So you felt that pressure, you felt that tension, and it was certainly felt by Ryan Day because they were excluded. They lose to Missouri in the Cotton Bowl, and the rest is history. So I'm with you, is that, again, I think the way you laid it out is perfect. Is I think the first time we're going to be like, oh, this is crazy. And then the second or third time we're going to be like, oh man, this doesn't feel as important. But then again, to your point, I think there's going to be a trickle down effect of a lot of games that maybe don't quite feel as important in this 12-team playoff era. Maybe I'm wrong. I don't know. I'll be curious. I'll also say this. The most interested that I am among many things is how do they treat losers of conference championship games versus the teams that are left out. Yeah. And I know it's a conversation everybody who loves college football has had. I don't need to give the example, but I've said I remember saying 5-6 years ago before we even expanded the playoff, I said, if you expand the playoff, you have to eliminate conference championship games, which clearly hasn't happened because there's going to be teams that are sitting at home that benefit it. So I'll be curious if we get Oregon, Ohio State in the conference championship game. Ohio State's already beaten Michigan. Michigan's at home. I would assume, that the loser of that game would still get the benefit of the doubt. We'll see. I know every scenario is going to be unique, but I think that's an interesting scenario as well.
It is, because I've run the model through the college football playoff era, which is easy to do because you can take the playoff committee's rankings and apply them directly. But you can do it even before that. You got to take the AP poll and just insert that for the playoff committee. And what you get consistently, Aaron, are every 10-2 team that was playing a conference championship game was safely in the playoff before that conference championship game. Then after they lost the conference championship game to go to 10-3, they dropped.
Sure.
Now, would the committee, though, make that same ranking decision with that much on the line? Before, it was just simply, oh, do we want to rank them 11 or 15, or, we'll do our due diligence and rank them where we think, but it doesn't matter. Nobody cares. Versus, oh, it now matters. Are we going to penalize Oregon for losing the Big Ten championship game? And what if Oregon lost that egregious, if they hang within a field goal of Ohio State, sure, even though the record slips, it's a commendable loss, versus, they lost 34-14. Are we going to penalize them?
No, it's a fascinating conversation. We obviously don't have an answer. And again, I listen, what you said, I totally believe, is the idea that, I think there's this thing of, well, I mean, you can't, if Michigan's sitting at home and Ohio State loses, or Michigan's sitting at home and Oregon loses, you can't penalize Oregon for being on the neutral field and whatever. But I do think, and again, we're in this business, there is a natural inclination to just believe the last thing you saw. And so, look at the Florida State conversation from last year. Look at previous years, previous conversations, whatever, where it's just like, it's just hard. What's the old saying? It's hard to unsee X, whatever it is, XYZ. But it's like, to that argument, if Oregon loses 34-14, well, how good were they really? It's like, well, I don't know. Penn State lost worse back in September to Ohio State, but we don't remember that. That wasn't just in front of our eyes. So these are conversations that I don't even think the committee has answers to right now, but it's crazy, crazy, crazy new world that we're entering.
If you get left out of a conference championship game, but you're safely in, you're 11-1, but there's some crazy three-way tie for first place at 11-1 or 8-1 in the conference, you get left out, or you're 10-2. And that's another dividing line that's pretty consistent, Aaron, looking back at history. The 10-2 teams, especially out of the Big Ten and the SEC, will get in. 9-3, you've got a small percentage, but you've got a chance if you're really impressive in the losses. But do you sit home and not make a conference championship game, even though you've got to play the first round game? You're going to play it at home, and you're going to play, look at this Georgia, Alabama, Michigan, Ohio State dynamic from last year. They were generally the four best teams in the country going into the final weekend of the season, viewed that way. Well, if you lose the conference championship game, you're still playing in the first round, versus missing the conference championship game, not having to play the first Saturday of December, resting, and still playing a first round playoff game at home.
There's so many variables and so many factors. Let me ask you just a broad question. Do you think that we as consumers are still going to react, especially to early season losses, the way that we used to? Because like last year, right? LSU gets destroyed by Florida State on the first weekend. And we're like, oh my, because their back really was against the wall. It's like, you lose one more. We know you got Bama on the schedule and whoever else. Like, if LSU loses to USC or USC loses to LSU, do you think it's going to be that code red freak out, whether it's from just the fan base, from the media, from whatever? Or do you think it's going to be maybe that's not even the best example. Like, if Clemson gets destroyed by Georgia, do we care, or do we just say, doesn't really matter? It's cool, but would have liked to see a little bit of a better effort. But if they win the ACC, they're getting in. Like I'm curious how the reaction will be to some of this stuff, and especially losses, especially early in the year.
Well, I think for the smart fan that's well read, they're going to know if you play in the Big Ten or the SEC, you can be the third or fourth place team and get in. In that scenario that you draw with Clemson, in a sense, that game's somewhat insignificant because Clemson still, you got to go win the ACC championship game, and this had nothing to do with winning the ACC.
Mm-hmm.
So you just lost 45-10, and people are going to look at you, and now this is going to cast a shadow on the ACC for people to say, well, the ACC is really not that good if you go ahead and win it. But yeah, that's an interesting dynamic. There was a post in one of the major publications today about how many teams could get to the playoff. And I think the number out there, I think it was Heather Dinich, put the number at 30. I started to count them up. If you include group of 5, I would even stretch it a little further than that because there's just so much parity in the Big 12, for example. You could have 7 teams coming out of that conference.
Yeah, it was funny. I actually saw the same article. And again, it goes to resetting our brains where I was like, oh, this is going to be one of those clickbait articles, because in the previous 4-team iteration, there was maybe like 8 to 10 that you were like, okay, like Iowa's not winning. Even if they win the Big Ten, they're not going to have a resume to get in, whatever. And then I was like, oh, wait a second now. Texas A&M could go 10-2 with that schedule. They could get in. And so, I saw that article as well, and it cracked me up because it's like, this is just a new world. And I think it'll be interesting, especially those first few weeks. I think there are results of consequence early in the season. The Florida Miami game, either way, where they're going to be praising Billy Napier or crushing him. I think the LSU USC game, even with in those power conferences, I think it's hard to see the pathway to 10-2 for either of those teams if they lose. But I guess the Clemson thing would be, like you said, it's like you lose 45-10. Well, just run the table in the ACC. I guess the argument would be, and then you're projecting way far ahead, is if they were up for an at-large bid, if they made the ACC championship game and lose to Florida State, whatever. But yeah, I'm just, as somebody who, listen, both you and I have, made a nice little living off of college football fans overreacting to everything on Saturday nights and Sunday mornings. I'm just curious to see what these reactions will be again, especially early when everyone's really trying to figure it out. I'm just curious to see what the reactions will be throughout the season.
Aaron Torres, Fox Sports Radio, Aaron Torres podcast. It's on here on YouTube, also on your favorite audio platform. Anything in particular that's going to make it easier, Aaron, for folks to be able to find you?
Yeah, I think just that Aaron _Torres, that's my personal Twitter handle. I post all my stuff over there. The Aaron Torres podcast, it's available Monday, Wednesday, Friday, especially during the season. Can't wait to, like everybody else, we'll be doing some live reactions after games. And then I'm fortunate enough, I do host Fox Sports Radio, 11 p.m. to 2 a.m. Eastern time. So we're always coming on after that big wave of games after 8 p.m. Eastern time. So excited to do that again. And yeah, man, it's a real fun time of year. You and I were talking before we went on air, Mark, is like, it's a fun time of year, but we've kind of had the same takes on all these teams since December and January and February. So as fun as it is, it's going to be even more fun once these games actually kick off.
No doubt about that. Aaron, great to see you. Thanks for stopping by.
Thank you for having me, Mark. Genuinely appreciate it.